You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is Wednesday, November 12th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. First, we want to announce that a new edition of Dr. Horne's book entitled Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, is available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Blows Against the Empire was originally published in 2008. This new edition of Blows Against the Empire includes a new introduction by Dr. Horne updating this classic text. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, as we go around the Horne. First, we want to ask you about Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara's visit to the White House on Monday, November 10th, marking a milestone both for Syrian heads of state and ex-Al-Qaeda figures. The Trump administration announced a new 6-month waiver of most Caesar Act sanctions on Syria, excluding transactions involving Russia and Iran. We also wanted to ask you about the upcoming visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who will be coming to the U.S. to meet with President Trump on November 18th. The visit will focus on strengthening U.S.-Saudi ties and is expected to include discussions and potential agreements on defense, intelligence sharing, AI, nuclear energy, and trade. Normalization with Israel will also be a topic of conversation. And before we turn the mic over, we also wanted to ask you about the news from this past Monday, November 10th, that according to French intelligence reports, the jihadists who have imposed a crippling fuel blockade in Mali and who want to topple the military junta and impose Islamist rule apparently do not want to rule the country themselves, which in our estimation is just further evidence that they are funded, armed, sponsored, and controlled by U.S. imperialism and its subordinates, including France and the UAE. Dr. Horne, turning the mic back over to you. What is your analysis of all of the news that we have put on the table?
Well, first of all, the visit of the de facto leader of Syria, speaking of al-Jilani al-Shara, followed by that of his chief international supporter, speaking of MBS of Saudi Arabia, it expresses the hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism. What I mean by that is, recall that we just talked about last week how Mr. Trump was threatening to invade Nigeria because of the purported killing of Christians. Yet he sanitizes this head chopper, speaking of al-Shara, who has authorized bombings of Christian churches, not to mention the difficulty that Christians have in Saudi Arabia in practicing their faith. And it also exposes the weaknesses, I'm afraid to say, of some of our friends on the U.S. left, because I recall before Mr. al-Shara assumed de facto power in Damascus, that many on Pacifica in particular, a radio network of which I share an affiliation, were cheerleading for him quite remarkably before he came to power in December 2024. I recall one time listening to these nostrums about al-Shara, and I immediately started a sort of short-lived boycott of Pacifica, which did not last long because, as noted, I have a long-term affiliation with that particular network. But Mr. al-Shara, assuming de facto power with the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, who's now in exile in Moscow, also means that he is creeping ever closer to Israel. For example, apparently there are Israeli agents ensconced as we speak in Damascus. We know that after he came to power, the Israelis began bombing incessantly in Damascus with hardly a peep or an outcry from Mr. al-Shara. We know that he is going to be enlisted in this conflict with Iran. Many of us still expect an attack on Iran before the end of this year. We also expect Mr. al-Shara and his thugs to cooperate with trying to crush Hezbollah in Lebanon. But perhaps the most dispiriting news about the rise of these religious zealots who somehow call themselves Muslims is that their ascendancy also has marked an ascendancy of enslaving of darker skinned people. Recall that after the overthrow of Mr. Gaddafi in Libya, 2010, 2011, those disturbing reports emerged. We also know that in the home of the so-called Arab Spring, as we speak in Tunisia, there is rampant persecution of the darker skin, irrespective of whether or not they're migrants or Tunisian nationals. This sort of alliance, as I'll talk about shortly, has deep roots. Many pundits and analysts, understandably, connected to Afghanistan in the late 1970s when US imperialism got into bed with religious zealots in order to destabilize the left-leaning People's Democratic Party in Kabul, which was then being assisted by the Soviet Union. That particular alliance worked to a degree insofar as it weakened the Soviet Union, helping to drive it out of existence. And it also led to the downfall of the People's Democratic Party and the rise of the so-called Taliban, which then repaid US assistance by supposedly cooperating with Saudi nationals. Saudi Arabia, of course, was a prime backer and benefactor of the Taliban. And recall that on September 11, 2001, 15 of 19 hijackers who seized US planes and flew them into skyscrapers, we are told, in New York City and into the Pentagon in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. 15 of the 19 hijackers, we're told, were actually Saudi nationals. So you would expect US imperialism to strike back with a vengeance with Saudi Arabia, but no. They were too close an ally, and so they struck back with a vengeance against Iraq, which had little or nothing to do with September 11th. But I think it's also fair to say that we need a deeper and closer analysis of the anti-Blackness of these reactionaries who dub themselves Muslims. Just yesterday, on the front page of the New York Times, was an article about what the Times called, quote, modern slavery, unquote, in Saudi Arabia. The target being women from East Africa, mostly Kenyan women. But this targeting of East Africans stretches back centuries, particularly spearheaded from the so-called Arabian Peninsula, with Ethiopia being a primary target. And in fact, it's remarkable to note the book that I'm working on now, which begins with enslavers from the United States defeated in the US Civil War, flocking en masse to Cairo, Egypt, where they spearhead and lead an expeditionary force into Abyssinia, into Ethiopia, with purposes of conquest, if not enslavement. It's also remarkable to note that this was nothing new, and they stayed in Cairo for quite a number of years and mounted other expeditions there. Today, U.S. allies, speaking of the United Arab Emirates, is wreaking havoc in Sudan by backing the so-called Rapid Support Forces and their titanic struggle with the Sudanese military. Credible stories of famine or emerging, not to mention pillaging and plunder. But it's also notable, as mentioned in these introductions that were just flashed on the screen, that as we speak in Mali, you have Mr. al-Shara's comrades in Al-Qaeda who are blockading Mali and attempting to strangle that particular regime, which, as you know, is in a kind of alliance with Mr. Traore's Burkina Faso and the newly minted regime in Niger. This may backfire and blow up in the face of US imperialism, because if those regimes are weakened, it'll probably have negative repercussions for Senegal, for Cote d'Ivoire. Even Ghana might be in jeopardy. And it's likely that these religious zealots are also backed by the allies of US imperialism, not least nationals from the Gulf monarchs. Returning to Egypt, and there hangs a tale, because the ruling clique in Cairo is permeated with anti-Blackness. It's ironic, given that their vaunted civilization is grounded in influence from the Nile River Valley, especially Nubia, which is replete with darker-skinned people. But recall what happened when the US Black American comic Kevin Hart had the temerity and audacity to mention that historic fact about Egyptian civilization being shaped by the Nile River Valley comrades, or erstwhile comrades, I should say, in Nubia. He was, of course, barred from doing a comedy show in Cairo. Recall the uproar that occurred when the actor and producer, Jada Pinkett Smith, sought to promote her film about Cleopatra that portrayed her as a melanin-rich woman. You would have thought that the film was portraying Cleopatra as some sort of one-eyed cyclops, for example. But I think that that sort of anti-Blackness also reflects one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for many of these Arab regimes, not least Egypt, to engage in meaningful solidarity with the Palestinians. Because how can you influence policy of the United States towards Israel? And of course, the United States is Israel's major backer, when you are relentlessly and casually even defaming and casting Black Americans as ostracized elements, when Black Americans are the community that's most likely to engage in solidarity with the Palestinians. And I should also say that this book that I'm working on now, which, as I note, begins with a story about Confederate soldiers leading forays into Ethiopia, it also makes the point that our movement in the late 19th century made a strategic miscalculation when they decided not to focus on surviving slavery, particularly in North Africa and in West Asia. It's also notable to remark that just as in Dixie, the US South, the cruel rationalization arose that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights, actually about a state's right to enslave darker skinned people, whereas slavery, particularly the darker skin, existed in Saudi Arabia well into the 20th century. And in fact, according to certain observers, Mecca and Medina, these holiest sites in the Islamic world and happen to be situated in Saudi Arabia, also were major slave markets. And of course, the Saudi elite argued that it wasn't states' rights, but their religion mandated that they should be allowed to enslave darker skinned people. And so, once again, if they had paid as much attention to a growing Zionism movement, particularly at the end of the 19th century, spreading into the 20th century, if they had paid more attention to that as opposed to enslaving darker skinned people, I think that the Palestinians, and in fact, the entire Arab world, would be better off. So what I would also mention is that we should reflect on the point that it's possibly not accidental that the major arm of Islam in Black America, the Nation of Islam, of course, came into being as a rejection of anti-Blackness And if you look at their newspaper, The Final Call, you'll often find comments like the ones that I'm making, particularly about anti-Blackness amongst those who dub themselves Muslim. But we need more of our non-Nation of Islam friends and comrades to remark upon what we've just articulated. That is to say, those from the Sunni branch of Islam in particular. And I should mention something that's quite disturbing that's come up in my research, which is that when the Saudi leaders showed up in Washington, D.C. in 1957, most likely they had in tow enslaved Nubians. Now, I guess it's progress that when MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, turns up in Washington rather shortly, he will not be accompanied by enslaved Nubians. So to that extent, I guess you can say we've made progress.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about the news from November 7th that Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is calling on the United Nations to investigate the U.S. federal government over its, quote, abusive immigration crackdowns in the city. Mayor Johnson's appearance at the United Nations Human Rights Council presents a political and policy challenge to other U.S. city leaders, including Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles, Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., Detroit City Council President Mary Sheffield, and Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens. Dr. Horne, it appears that Chicago Mayor Johnson is taking a more internationalist approach to President Trump's deployment of unidentified armed masked men to Chicago to terrorize, brutalize, and disappear Chicago residents. But Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of this news?
Well, I take my hat off to Mayor Johnson of Chicago. He has established that he is in the vanguard with regard to fighting back against creeping fascism in this country by taking the Trump regime into the halls of the United Nations, emulating the late, great Paul Robeson, whose picture was just flashed on the screen with regard to his We Charge Genocide petition, also filed at the United Nations circa 1950, 1951. And I would like to see the African American Mayors Association, which encompasses hundreds of Black mayors, representing about 48 million people, seek to join Mayor Johnson's effort. And he should not only be accompanied by the AAMA, he should be accompanied by some of these progressive mayors recently elected, like Mayor Mamdani of New York City. I'm thinking of Katie Wilson of Seattle, just elected apparently as a socialist, social democrat, leading City Hall in the Pacific Northwest state. I'm speaking of Hannah Schvetz of Ithaca, New York, elected to the city council of that campus town on a Communist Party ticket. I'm thinking also of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, the Progressive Caucus. All should link arms with Mayor Johnson because we know that historically, the attempt to beat back slavery, then Jim Crow, and today's neo-fascism, which is their close cousin, it has come from internationalism in the first instance. And so once again, we salute Mayor Johnson.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to put several seemingly interrelated stories together to get your analysis. First, on November 6th, the leaders of all 5 Central Asian nations with President Trump at the White House for a summit under the C5+1 format. The heads of state of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan attended the summit. The purpose of the summit seemed to be an attempt by the U.S. to direct critical mineral supply chains away from China and Russia and towards the U.S. On the other side of the ledger, it was reported on November 7th that Russia President Putin answered Venezuelan President Maduro's call to help Venezuela resist Trump and the growing U.S. war machine surrounding not just Venezuela, but much of Latin America and the Caribbean. The Venezuelan Foreign Affairs Minister Ivan Gil later expressed his country's gratitude to Russia for its stance in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty in the face of the war the U.S. is waging against them. In addition, November 7th, 1917, was the anniversary of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution, and President Trump took the Red Scare to new heights by inaugurating and proclaiming the week of November 7th as Anti-Communism Week. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of all of these stories we have put together?
Well, let me add another story which could be linked to the foregoing. I'm speaking of the fact that our tax dollars have just been allocated to a boondoggle, a multi-part documentary marking the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, which the filmmaker Ken Burns, quite astonishingly, has said that 1776 was the most important event, says Ken Burns, since the birth of Jesus Christ, believe it or not. That is not a fabricated quote. And sadly enough, this documentary will be praised to the high heavens, even though the founding of the United States of America led to intensified genocide against the indigenous population, not to mention their wholesale dispossession, not to mention an exponential increase in the African slave trade. And this is something we're supposed to celebrate, believe it or not. What we should be celebrating, for example, is what was mentioned in the prelude, which is the Bolshevik Revolution, which led directly to the liberation of African nations, Caribbean nations, Asian nations, for example. And it should also be saluted for leading to the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which in turn led to Cuban soldiers going to Southern Africa, beginning approximately 50 years ago this month, to defeat the CIA and apartheid military in Southwest Africa, leading to the consolidation of Angolan independence and ultimately the independence of neighboring Namibia, and of course, the solidifying of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, leading to their independence in 1980, and then the Big Enchilada, South Africa in 1994. We have argued many times on this program that the Haitian Revolution, culminating in 1804, led to a general crisis of slavery that could only be resolved with its collapse. At one time, many revolutionary forces argued that November 1917 marked the general crisis of capitalism that could only be resolved with its collapse. But sadly enough, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that particular theory of the case was junked by many. But now, speaking from the vantage point of 2025, we see that that was a mistake, because the triumph in 1917 led to the triumph in China in 1949. And in order to dig itself out of the hole that had been created, US imperialism cut an anti-Soviet deal with China, but alas, it's backfired spectacularly, since China is clearly in the passing lane, which should have come clear even to the naive with that meeting in South Korea between Mr. Trump and President Xi Jinping, when metaphorically China punched US imperialism in the face by seeking to circumscribe the export of rare earth minerals necessary for fighter jets and smartphones and automobiles and the like. And Mr. Trump hardly had a response, and of course, probably likely will not have a response going forward. And so I think that it's also important to note that other items that have popped up in the past week that are relevant to these stories. Not only this meeting in the White House of leaders of the Central Asian nations, all former Soviet republics, by the way. And as I've watched the news about this gathering in the White House, I immediately began to think of the rampant anti-Sovietism, which I'm afraid to say also infected some of our friends on the left, which caused them to cheer for the collapse of the Soviet Union, I guess not realizing that it would lead to the Central Asian nations, at least some of them, seeking to snuggle up to US imperialism and therefore strengthening US imperialism. But I also think that the story about Venezuela reveals the kind of casual Russophobia that is too common in our movement. The fact that Moscow is seeking to come to the aid of Caracas should not be shocking nor surprising. In the aforementioned book that I'm now working on, one of the reasons why Ethiopia was able to survive the incursions by Italian colonialism in the late 19th century was because they were armed to the teeth by Russia. In other words, what the Soviet Union did post 1917 in some ways mirrored and mimicked what pre-1917 Russia was doing, for example, in the 1890s or in the 1860s, when the Russian fleet, in order to bulwark the tottering Lincoln regime in Washington, sent its fleet both to the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, which was quite intimidating to the Confederate States of America. And I should note as well that after 1917, as I will talk about in this book, the Communist International, headquartered in Moscow, sent its agents into East Africa to support liberation movements. Many of them were headquartered, in fact, in Addis Ababa, one of the few non-colonies on the African continent. And this is something that we should be celebrating. Certainly, if anything, we should be protesting our tax dollars being allocated to this boondoggle documentary series of Ken Burns, fundamentally celebrating genocide and mass enslavement.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horn, staying on the topic of the U.S. war against Venezuela, which also seems targeted at all of Latin America and the Caribbean. The U.S. has killed at least 76 people in a series of military strikes on boats suspected of drug trafficking in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific Ocean since the campaign began on September 2nd, 2025, and on November 7th. It was reported that U.S. Southern Command, Southcom, Commander Admiral Alvin Halsey arrived in Guyana last Thursday for a 2-day visit. The stated purpose of Admiral Halsey's visit is to deepen defense collaboration between the U.S. and Guyana. Dr. Horne, what is your assessment of Admiral Halsey's visit to Guyana and the growing U.S. military presence and aggression in the region?
Well, I have to say I was particularly saddened by this news concerning Guyana. On the screen is the book that I produced some years ago that deals in no small measure with the history of Guyana. That is to say, even before the Cuban Revolution, you had the coming into influence, if not power, the People's Progressive Party in 1953, led by the late Chetty Jagan of South Asian ancestry, leading to intervention by British colonialism and U.S. imperialism to weaken, if not topple, his regime. And then they followed that with seeking, not unsuccessfully, to stir up antagonism between the population of South Asian ancestry and the population of African descent. And I have a personal stake in this matter because it was in 1980, for the trial of the late Walter Rodney, that I visited Georgetown, Guyana as a legal observer, and there met Chetty Jagan, who I then encountered a number of times on these shores. And of course, after I returned to the United States with confidence that Walter would be acquitted, he was assassinated. And so Guyana has been on a slippery slope since then. It's being exploited shamelessly by U.S. oil giants who have an interest now in adding to their windfall in Guyana by seizing Venezuela's oil as well. But at the end of the day, I'm confident that this particular attempt to overthrow Mr. Maduro in Caracas will not be successful. Indeed, I'm beginning to surmise that the sending of all of these battleships and nuclear submarines and the like to the waters of Venezuela was supposed to lead to a kind of internal coup. But as we've reported previously on this program, the Maduro regime, bolstered and bulwarked by Cuba's intelligence, not to mention comrades and friends from neighboring Colombia, is probably coup-proof, although time will tell. But in any case, I think we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.